Hello, Scruff welcome to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. Summer is in full swing. I got shit to do. I can't make videos all the time, but here we are, finally making another video. And this time it's about that one time in the 80s when a Viggen fighter jet won a dogfight without firing a single shot. So it's the 7th of July 1985, and well, it's the middle of the Cold War. You have the Soviet Union doing all kinds of shenanigans. Sweden is keeping a close eye on things. Just a couple of years before, we had the Whiskey on the Rocks incident when we had a nuclear-armed Russian submarine getting stuck inside of Swedish territorial waters, and the Swedes weren't impressed by that. The Russians sent 12 warships to try and retrieve the submarine, and Sweden decided, if you cross our border, we will sink every last one of you. And the Russians backed down, and diplomacy had its course, and well, we had no war back then. So as you can imagine, the 80s was a bit of a touch and go situation between Sweden and the Soviet Union. So anyways, July 1985. The Russians, the Soviets, are having a big or semi-big navy exercise in the Baltic Sea, and naturally Sweden wants to know what's going on, which ships are involved, what are they doing, and stuff like that. So Sweden decides to send out a reconnaissance flight, a single Viggen fighter jet called Martin Röd 03, Martin Red 03. Piloted by Captain Göran Larsson. And he's flying an SH-37. That is a basically maritime recon version of the Viggen fighter jet. The SH stands for Spaning Havsövervakning. Spaning means reconnaissance. Havsövervakning means ocean surveillance. Yeah, not always easy connecting the Swedish and the English, but it's ocean surveillance and reconnaissance. So it's a fighter jet specifically modified and designed to operate at sea and keeping an eye on things. Can still hold can still hold missiles and stuff like that, but it's specifically designed with a slightly different radar and meant to carry cameras and stuff like that. So they send Martin Röd 03 to keep an eye on this Russian-Soviet naval exercise. And before moving on, I just want to highlight that the Viggen, if you're not aware, was a quality fighter jet of its time, designed in the 60s and 70s. And it could hold its own with the best fighters found in the US and Soviet air forces. This was not some odd thing from Sweden. This was a state-of-the-art fighter jet that stood a real good chance of being able to outmaneuver and outgun anything in the air. And also it's quite famously locked on to the Blackbird, the United States spy plane, and it also at one time with 4 Viggen escorted a Blackbird out of harm's way as the Blackbird in question was being chased by, I think it was something like 20 Soviet fighters. So a very capable fighter. But now we're talking about the reconnaissance version for maritime use. So just keep that in mind as we continue with the story. So we have the Baltic Sea, and Martin Röd 03, based in Norrköping, took to the skies, intent of reaching Latvia and keeping an eye on these Soviet ships. The problem here is that the Swedish doctrine was that you fly low and do reconnaissance up close and personal, flying right past the ships in question. So it would be difficult to maintain radio contact and radar contact with friendly installations on the Swedish island of Gotland. So you had 2 Viggen on standby outside of Gotland acting as relay to be able to convey information to the reconnaissance aircraft flying close to Russian ships. And these two Viggen were also in support should something happen. They were interceptors, outfitted for air-to-air combat. So they were just hanging around in their back at Gotland, acting as relay for information being passed on to the reconnaissance aircraft. And Göran Larsson, the pilot, he decided to make this reconnaissance in 2 trips because he realized he would not have enough fuel to do proper reconnaissance on all the ships and gather all the intel that the Swedish armed forces wanted from this mission. So he decided to make 2 trips, and he flew out, crossed the sea, and sure enough found the Soviet warships. And almost instantly he received information from his friends back at Gotland that 2 Soviet fighters were coming straight for him. And the Soviets sent out 2 Su-15 Flagon F interceptor fighters, and they caught up to Martin Red 03 quickly enough, and the Soviets meant business. These aircraft were routinely armed to the teeth, usually with 2 radar guiding missiles, 2 heat-seeking missiles, and 2 gun pods for up close and personal dogfights. And the Soviets decided to follow Captain Göran Larsson around, and he did some maneuvers, and one of the fighters just kept on him at steady distance from his left wing, and he actually retrieved his own personal camera and took some photos of it. And this lead Soviet fighter marked in yellow with 36, so it became known to the Swedes as Gul 36, which means yellow 36. This aircraft was, I mean, 1 or 2 wingspans away from Martin Red 03, as it just followed him through various maneuvers, and he took some photos of it, and it is damn close. I mean, they could have straight out of Top Gun waved at each other. But he continued his reconnaissance, broke off. The Russians got the point across. Hey, if you stick around, you're gonna find out. And so Martin Red 03 returned to base to refuel, hand over the film he had used, and then it was time to take to the air once more. And so Martin Red 03 took off once more, like I said, and did so with radio silence, just in case the Russians were listening in, so not to give away anything, right? So Martin Red 03 takes off again, having refueled new film in the cameras, and sets out to sea. So Captain Göran Larsson, he swings around Gotland, heads for Latvia, and takes aim for the Russian ships once more. And this is when he receives news from the Viggen in the air above Gotland. Hostile fighters in the air to his northeast, 50 kilometers, closing fast. It is the same pair of Su-15 as before, and in 3 minutes they have caught up with the Viggen. Martin Red 03 took his fighter through a couple of turns, and the Soviets kept following him, and eventually he figured, enough of this, it's time to do this for real, and he took his fighter through a series of maneuvers. One of the Russians in particular decided to stay behind Martin Red 03 while the other one remained behind, just keeping an eye on the situation. And the Soviet fighter chasing Martin Red 03 stayed behind him roughly 50 meters through every twist and turn. It was a fast-paced chase, and eventually Martin Red 03 went through a high G turn at 500 meters above the water, flying something like 600 kilometers an hour as he pushed through this tight, hard turn. Finishing his maneuver at roughly 100 meters above the water, Captain Göran Larsson took a look behind him and saw how the Soviet pilot tried to keep up through the maneuver but failed and crashed straight into the water 200 meters behind the Viggen fighter jet. The massive splash was shortly followed by a huge explosion as the aircraft and more than likely its missiles detonated from the force of the impact. It was a brutal death. And Martin Red 03 never saw any ejection seat flying off from the aircraft either. There was no doubt about it. The Soviet pilot died a violent, horrible death, having failed in trying to keep up with the Swedish pilot. Göran Larsson decided enough is enough and headed straight back towards Gotland Island. This is when he realized that the other Su-15, now roughly 5 kilometers away, took chase as well and locked on with missiles. In a desperate attempt to outrun the Soviet fighter that was now taking chase, Martin Red 03 hit Mach 1.1 and tried to stay at only 50 meters above the ocean. The two Viggen at Gotland had now moved in to intercept the Soviet fighter chasing Martin Red 03. The Soviet fighter dropped its lock, turned around and headed back to base. Martin Red 03, piloted by Captain Göran Larsson, managed to return to base without harm, without injury, and had survived a deadly confrontation with two Soviet fighters. And as you can see here, I've actually marked how the Viggen flew being chased by the Soviets. And just to get some sense on what was going on, if we start with point A, this is where the Soviets decided to take chase for real and the dogfight began. That took place at 250 meters above the water at 550 kilometers per hour. And then we move down to point B when the real maneuvering begins. Now we are at 150 meters, flying 675 kilometers per hour. And that tight turn then goes up to 450 meters, 550 kilometers per hour. And then we go down to point D, that is 150 meters, and now they are at 675 kilometers per hour as they go into that tight turn. And then we move up to point E, Echo, and as you can see, that's a tight loop, right? And this is where we have the Viggen doing at 150 meters, going 675 kilometers per hour, and then it goes up to 250 meters, doing 650 kilometers per hour. So this is more than likely where he forced the Russian plane into the water after point Echo, because then at the Foxtrot, point F, we have the Viggen at 150 meters, and this is where he kicks off the afterburner going Mach 1, and this is where Swedish intelligence summarizes that this is where the Soviet decided to lock on with missiles on Martin Red 03 as he made his escape. So quite incredible, a damn tough situation where a Swedish pilot was chased by two Soviets, and well, the better aircraft and the better pilot won the day in the end in this high G, high maneuver dogfight that took place between these two aircraft and these two pilots. So what happened after this incident? Not much really. Captain Göran Larsson, well, I guess he got slapped on the fingers a bit, but Swedish armed forces, the Swedish Air Force, their main concern was that he had actually shown the Soviets the true capabilities of the Viggen fighter jet. They weren't that concerned that a Soviet pilot had died. They were concerned that the Soviets now had an eyewitness account from a pilot and from radar operators on what the Viggen was capable of in a dogfight. And this was what the Swedish Air Force was concerned about. So they basically told Captain Larsson that you do what you're supposed to do and nothing else. You don't fly any fancy circus shenanigans out there, right? Because you're giving away our capabilities to the enemy. The Soviets made no fuss about this incident. There was no diplomatic mayhem because of this. The Soviets, for some reason, let this slip, and the reason is probably because the pilot that actually did chase Martin Ritter through was known as a bit of a hotshot pilot, probably a skilled pilot that kind of did his own thing in true Hollywood fashion. And the Soviets were like, yeah, that was completely on the pilot, and let's just drop it. He messed up and he paid the price for it. So there was no international incident from this encounter between these fighter jets and these pilots. And just to get a feel for Viggen pilots and the Viggen aircraft, we have a interview with a British pilot named Mike Rondot. Now, Rondot served or spent 13 years flying as a Jaguar pilot and managed to do 29 combat missions in the Gulf in 1991. So this is a guy with some pretty decent experience of flying a fighter jet. And he, in this interview, tells us that Viggen pilots regularly would fly at Mach 0.95, and they would train at 10 meters off the ground. So 30 feet going 600 knots, 650 knots. And as he points out, this was done with a heavy overcast. And they, didn't hold back. And if you flew like that in the Royal Air Force, you would not have a long career at all. And he ends it all basically by saying it knocked all the myths about who's got the best airplanes, who's got the best trained pilots, and so on. So he is in this interview praising the Swedish Air Force, the Viggen fighter jet, and the Swedish pilots in particular to no end. And according to this combat veteran British fighter pilot, there's no contest. The Swedish Viggen and the Swedish pilots were the best in the world at the time. So with this in mind, maybe it wasn't so strange that a single Viggen managed to so effectively outmaneuver a couple of Soviet fighters flying low at dangerous speeds out above the Baltic Sea when all is said and done. And yeah, that's it. I don't think that all that many people are aware of this incident since it wasn't a big diplomatic situation that resulted from it. But I think it's worth highlighting, reminding people that this shit went down during the Cold War, and Swedish aircraft, Swedish pilots did what they had to do and performed very well. And I mean, they did all kinds of strange stuff. They flew missions with Tunnan back in the 50s over Soviet territory, in overland in Poland and the Baltic states, and photographed Soviet military installations at 10-20 meters above ground level. So basically flying straight across the buildings they were photographing. Insane. And, the planes were... had no marking, so even if it was recognizable as a Swedish Tunnan, the Soviets couldn't tell or point at it and go, oh, that's a Swedish aircraft. A bunch of crazy stuff. And on a Lansen reconnaissance aircraft flew in in the middle of a Soviet exercise, naval exercise, where they use live ammunition. So while the Russians are firing live rounds in their exercise, a Swedish reconnaissance aircraft is doing circles around these warships, taking pictures as the warships are shooting into the air. Just insane stuff. So anyway, yep, that's all I have for you this time around. Hope you found it interesting, and I hope I'll see you in the next one. Bye.